Thanks for that great introduction, Brian. So my name's Kevin Hines. I'm a wildlife disease biologist. 28 years of experience cutting up dead animals, figuring out how they died, looking for contaminants, etc. We also do forensic necropsies for conservation officers across the state in poaching cases typically. I'm also the New York State Wildlife Health Program leader, which I've been for the past 3 or 4 years. Today I'm going to talk to you guys about the Wildlife Health Program, kind of how it's set up, how it works, what we do. And then since I knew there was going to be a bunch of hunters here, I was hoping to talk about some deer diseases. So we're going to talk about epizootic hemorrhagic disease, which I thought would be interesting since we've had 2 pretty good sized outbreaks back to back the past 2 years. I'm going to talk about chronic wasting disease because I talk about chronic wasting disease wherever I go to talk. It's probably the most important disease of deer that there ever has been and maybe ever will be. And you guys should be pretty concerned about it, so I want to give you some information about that. I'm going to talk about maybe a couple funny little things you might see in deer that you take that we get a lot of questions about. And I'm going to talk about lead ammunition and bald eagle poisonings, to give you some information about that. And then there's probably some other diseases too that are on there. I don't know if I'll make it all the way through. I think, how long is this? This 2 hours? Oh, that's a long time till I'm done. So I might start talking fast because I do have a lot of stuff packed into the end of it. So I might sound like an auctioneer at some point, but we'll try to get through everything. Typically, you questions you can just ask them, and I'm happy to answer them. As you ask them, as long as we don't get too far off base. So the Wildlife Health Program used to be called the Wildlife Pathology Unit prior to 2010. And the pathologist, Ward Stone, some of you older fellows may have known Ward. He was my boss for many years. When he retired in 2010, we applied for a federal grant so that we could expand the program, make it bigger. What we really wanted to do was team up with a university. And in our case, the logical choice was Cornell Veterinary College. So we teamed up with them so we'd have access to their labs. Because before that, we were always begging and borrowing from the health department in different labs, trying to get some testing done, and we didn't really have a lot of money. So now we're funded with a series of federal grants. It's Pittman-Robertson money, return wildlife restoration money, which is a tax on firearms, ammunition. And with that money, we're able to expand the program. What we typically do is we're working to keep track of diseases that we know we have in New York, but we want to keep track of their levels, like rabies and distemper. We're looking for diseases that we don't think we have in New York, but we expect could show up at any moment. Chief among those is chronic wasting disease, which I'll be telling you about soon. And then we're also looking for diseases that aren't really on anybody's radar yet, right? So we all just lived through the COVID-19 thing. That's a disease that kind of just popped up. Other cases, certainly in New York, we had West Nile virus show up in 1999. That started in New York. That wasn't on anybody's radar. That was the time it appeared in the Western Hemisphere. White nose syndrome in bats is another disease that just kind of popped up, wasn't on anybody's radar. So we're looking for things we know about, things we don't know about. The staff at the Delmar lab where I work consists of myself, and apparently I've only got one shirt. Ashley Stevens, who's a research scientist. She has been with us about 5 years. She's really getting some pretty good experience, and she's really getting to the point where she's super valuable to me. And she's leaving in July to pursue graduate studies in coral diseases, so we're going to lose Ashley, unfortunately. Lauren Miller is our new research scientist. She was a fish and wildlife technician with us for about 3 years or so, and so we're getting her into doing necropsy work now. And Britton Robinson is our new fish and wildlife technician that we just hired out of SUNY Cobleskill. Out of Cornell, we've got a wildlife veterinarian, Dr. Elizabeth Bunting. DEC has always wanted a wildlife veterinarian because they're very useful for a lot of the things that we do. Whenever we're collaring animals and stuff, you really want to have a veterinarian on staff guiding all that stuff for animal welfare concerns, etc. We use her for chemical immobilization, helping us come up with protocols and stuff for that. Euthanasia. She's always has a lot to say about the way we're killing critters. Kristen Schuler is a PhD wildlife disease ecologist. She did her PhD on chronic wasting disease in Wind Cave National Park, and she worked at the National Wildlife Health Center for a number of years. And that's a lab that kind of does what we do, but they do it at the federal level for the entire country. She's considered probably at this point, probably one of the top 10 chronic wasting disease experts in the country, and we're very fortunate to have her on our team. Dr. Beth Buckles is a board-certified wildlife pathologist, and she does necropsies out of the Ithaca campus. Gavin Hitchner is a wildlife pathologist that runs the Cornell Duck Lab down on Long Island, and we're using him to look at deer down there because historically we've had a really hard time getting deer carcasses off the island and up to the Del Mar lab for examination, so we weren't really seeing many deer. So now they can just drop them off down there and he takes care of them for us. So that's been a real good help. Jennifer Peasley's administration. Nick Hollingshead is a data analyst, and he helps us with our database, which I'll talk about a little bit in a second. And Melissa Fadden, although it says researcher aide, she's like a fish and wildlife technician for them there, and she helps make sure that all the specimens are going where they need to go and get collected in a succinct fashion. So when we designed this program, back in 2010, we were using the One Health principles to help guide it. And back in 2010, not a lot of people, this was kind of a new concept, but it's pretty ingrained now. And it's that idea that human health, wildlife health, domestic animal health, environmental health are all intertwined. And what it's forced us to do is we strive to have very close associations with Division of Ag and Markets, New York State Health Department, so we can address these, human health issues. So, for example, we're having a highly pathogenic, high-path avian influenza outbreak currently, and we're assisting Ag and Markets and USDA with some of that work. So we're on the phone with them all the time, so if there's ever a disease that I see on the table that I think that might affect them, we always send them a note, and we're in constant communication, and which is important, especially with Ag and Markets, because Ag and Markets regulates the captive deer industry in New York, and with chronic wasting disease, we have a lot of concerns related to that. So 60% or so of the diseases that affect animals or that affect humans also affect animals. They come from animals. And of those 60%, 70% of that 60% have a wildlife component. They're diseases that go typically from wildlife into people. These are called zoonotic diseases. And examples of those would be, we got this picture of the skunk and the dog, rabies, which is a very common disease in New York now. Actually, raccoon rabies first came into New York about the time I started, and it spread pretty quickly. But you've got the skunk. If the skunk had rabies, the skunk could give potentially rabies to the dog, and then the humans could get exposed by having contact with the dog, especially if the dog wasn't vaccinated for rabies and he came down with rabies himself. This is kind of not so much an issue with dogs in New York because make sure that they're vaccinated, but feral cats and cats in general can be, they're probably one of the biggest bridge species between them. Avian influenza, I mentioned we're having an avian influenza outbreak currently. These viruses typically will be carried in ducks, wild waterfowl, mallards in particular. They get infected with the virus and it doesn't affect them. They can spread it along their travels, and if they get into a domestic bird like a chicken or a turkey, kill them. And we're currently, we've got avian influenza virus in the wild birds up and down the East Coast. We know that because we've been sampling hunter-killed birds, or the feds have been sampling most of them. And we've got it in a couple commercial poultry operations. So this could actually take off and be a really big problem for commercial poultry this season. So keep an eye on that. And the concern is that it could potentially get into a pig or a human. And we haven't seen many cases of this particular strain going into people. But if it did, the idea is if you were infected with a human strain of the flu, and then you were co-infected with the avian strain of the flu, those guys could recombine in there and come up with a new flu that, they call it the super flu, potentially. And it could be really transmissible from person to person, but could also be really pathogenic and could kill a lot of people. And so scientists have been predicting for years that a super flu is going to come, much like the Spanish flu of 2018, and much like kind of what SARS did now, but maybe worse. And so that's something that's on everybody's mind. So all of our staff have to get the seasonal flu vaccine every year just to make sure that reduce the potential that they might be co-infected, because we're cutting up birds that could potentially have avian flu on the table. West Nile virus is a arbovirus. It spreads typically between mosquitoes and birds. Sometimes it gets into horses and people, and it can be fatal in some people. Most people that get infected with West Nile virus from mosquito bite have no idea that they were ever infected. They don't get sick. Some people have mild flu-like symptoms, and some people, a small percentage of people, develop encephalitis and they can die. And it also can be fatal to horses. Back in 1999, when this first came in, our lab played a pretty decent role in helping to identify the virus itself. Because when it first came in, nobody really knew what it was. We have people in Staten Island that were diagnosed with St. Louis encephalitis, and they were sick, and some of them were dying. And at the same time, we had crows and blue jays and other birds dying down in those same areas. And we got those birds up to the lab, and based on the knowledge we had at the time, looking at the gross pathology, it looked like they were organochlorine poisonings, which is something we see down in the Long Island area. But all the tests kept coming back negative for that. And then we said, well, maybe it's a virus. So we sent it to the National Wildlife Health Lab and to ask if they could check it for viruses. And they were able to find a virus, but they could grow the virus, but they didn't know what it was. So they asked the CDC if they'd look at it, and they weren't interested, so they sent it to the National Veterinary Services Lab. They grew the virus, they couldn't identify it, and they sent it to the CDC, and the CDC eventually determined that it was West Nile virus, and that was based on liver tissue from one of the crows from our lab. And then they determined that the people didn't have St. Louis encephalitis, it was West Nile virus, and then West Nile virus went on to spread across the country in about 5 years. It was in California. So it's an interesting, exciting job. So about every 2 years, myself, staff from the Cornell lab will go around to the DEC regions. As many of you know, New York is separated into 9 DEC regions. And we'll meet with wildlife staff, and we'll put on a day-long seminar. And we always start out with zoonotic diseases, what diseases they can catch from wildlife, and how to protect themselves so they can collect dead wildlife specimens and get them into the lab without infecting themselves with anything. And then we'll tell them some research projects that we're working on. We'll tell them about diseases we're expecting to see, stuff to keep their eye out for. So they've got a pretty good idea what we're looking for at any given time. Plus I communicate with them via email. And we'd like to have that face-to-face contact every couple of years so they know who we are and we can, remain friendly. So they don't hesitate to call me or to send us emails and say, hey, we're seeing this. Are you interested in this? And we'll say yeah or no. So the way the surveillance process typically works, the public reports a dead animal. Somebody will find one. One guys will be out hunting. You'll find a couple dead deer, or you'll find some dead fisher or whatever. You'll call Brian Canzeri and say, hey, I found this. Brian will contact us. Submit the carcass. Field staff will put all the information into this computerized database that we have. And when the animal comes in, large animals from the western part of the state, like deer and bear, go to the Cornell facility rather than try to truck them all the way to Delmar. But everything else gets put in coolers and shipped UPS and comes to the Delmar lab for necropsy. And we'll take that that information that comes with it, we just click a button, all the information that they put in comes down into our database. We'll do a necropsy on the bird, so that's a thorough external examination and an internal examination. It's very methodical, and we're looking for lesions, right? So a lesion is anything that's kind of out of the ordinary, anything that's unusual. So that could be a broken bone, it could be hemorrhage, it could be a tumor, it could be some necrotic tissue, some pus, etc. That's all what lesions are. And this job really just boils down to being able to pick out lesions, unusual things, in animals. It's pretty simple, really. But the hard part is that there's so many different species. And you have to know a lot about each different species to know if you're seeing a lesion or not. You need to know what each species should look like at each different time of year, how much fat should they be carrying, what kind of body condition are they typically in. Even though the organ plan is very similar for all of them, the organs themselves can be pretty different. So you need to know, what a bear kidney looks like versus a raccoon kidney versus an otter kidney, etc. And you kind of need to know what normal looks like for each one of those in order to pick out things that are abnormal. So we do these necropsies, and typically about 50% of the time we've got a really good idea. We've got a diagnosis based just looking at the gross pathology, just cutting it open and looking at it with our bare eyes. And oftentimes we don't go any further than that. We just make the diagnosis from that. But sometimes, some diseases, we need to confirm it. So we'll need to take tissues. Let's say we suspect something has rabies. We'll send it to the brain tissue to the rabies lab for confirmation of that. We'll send liver tissues, and this is where Cornell, our contract with Cornell really comes in handy, because they've got this beautiful animal health diagnostic center that was built with Ag and Markets money, because that's their main customer. But they have a full suite of histology, bacteriology, parasitology, toxicology. So all these tests, we can simply just put them in a cooler, put them in our database, and order all the tests we want. And then when the results come back, they all get into that database, right to the case file. So all the information for each animal is all in one file on this database, and we're able to just push a button and come up with a whole report and send it out via email. Everything from this one file. Field staff have access to it, so they can look at it and they can log in and they can see where their cases are. Have we looked at it yet? What are we seeing? How far are we in the necropsy? And then we're also able to detect trends. We can make graphs and look at each different species and each different disease and see where they are spatially across the state and what the are. So the database is really pretty remarkable, and it's worked out pretty well for us.